Picture this. 10,000 years before Christ, along the mist-shrouded coastlines of what we now call the Pacific Northwest, where towering cedar trees disappear into perpetual fog and the air tastes of salt and rain. A young Tlingit man named Ketchikan stands at the edge of a rushing river, watching something that would make your jaw drop if you saw it today. The salmon are running. Now, when I say running, I don't mean a few fish swimming upstream. I mean a living, writhing, silver highway of fish, so dense you could practically walk across their backs. Imagine the entire population of a small city, but made of salmon, all trying to swim up the same river at the same time. The water itself seems to turn metallic, glinting and flashing as thousands upon thousands of fish surge against the current like some kind of ancient aquatic conveyor belt. Ketchikan's watching this natural miracle, but he's seeing something his elders aren't. While the older fishermen are down at the water's edge with their traditional spears and handheld nets, rasos, tools that had worked for their grandfathers and their grandfathers' grandfathers, this young man is envisioning something that must have seemed absolutely insane to everyone around him. He's imagining a fence, not just any fence, but a massive barrier of woven cedar bark that would stretch completely across the river. Think about that for a moment. This isn't some little stream we're talking about. This is a major river system, hundreds of feet wide, with powerful currents that could knock a grown man off his feet. And this young guy is proposing to build what amounts to the world's first industrial fishing apparatus, using nothing but cedar bark, wooden stakes, and Stone Age tools. The village reaction? Well, let's just say they weren't exactly lining up to help with his crazy project. You can imagine the conversations around the fire. Did you see what Ketchikan's doing down by the river? He's lost his mind. Thinks he can catch fish with a fence. The laughter probably echoed through the longhouses for weeks. But Ketchikan kept working, month after month, gathering materials, weaving bark, testing designs. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because what this young innovator was developing wasn't just a bigger net, it was a complete system. His weird design would funnel thousands of fish into holding pens where they could be processed at leisure, rather than the frantic race against time that traditional fishing methods required. Then winter came early. Harsh storms battered the coast. The salmon runs that everyone had counted on failed. Traditional fishing methods that had sustained the village for generations suddenly weren't working. Food stores ran dangerously low. Starvation, real deadly starvation, began stalking the longhouses. That's when Ketchikan's ridiculous fence proved its worth. In just 3 days, his revolutionary weir system caught enough salmon to feed the entire village for 6 months. 3 days. 6 months of food security. Think about that ratio for a moment. This wasn't just a technological improvement. This was a game changer that meant the difference between life and death for an entire community. Word of this miracle spread like wildfire through trading networks that already connected indigenous peoples from Alaska down to California. And here's something that might surprise you. These weren't primitive communication systems. We're talking about sophisticated trade routes that moved information, goods, and innovations across thousands of miles. News of Ketchikan's weir technology traveled faster than any European explorer would ever manage to move through this same territory. The Chinook people, living at the mouth of the mighty Columbia River, heard about these innovations and thought, we can do better. They developed even more ambitious designs. Wooden platforms that extended 50 feet out over churning rapids. 50 feet! That's like building a pier over a washing machine on steroids. These platforms allowed fishermen to dip net salmon by the thousands from positions that would have been impossible to reach from shore. But here's where human nature kicks in. Innovation sparked conflict. Around 9,000 years before Christ, something historians now call the Great Salmon War erupted when 5 rival nations realized they were all competing for control of the most productive fishing sites. This wasn't some minor skirmish over a good fishing hole. This was full-scale warfare over what amounted to the oil fields of the ancient world. The epicenter of this conflict was Celilo Falls, where the Columbia River compressed into narrow channels, creating what was quite literally the greatest salmon fishing site on planet Earth. Picture Niagara Falls, but instead of tourists with cameras, you've got warrior fishermen fighting battles that would rage for generations over access to this aquatic gold mine. The fighting only ended when Chief Thunderfish of the Nez Perce managed to negotiate what became known as the First Salmon Accord. This wasn't just a peace treaty, it was a sophisticated legal framework that established fishing rights that would endure for millennia. We're talking about property law and resource management systems that would last longer than any European empire. The fishing techniques themselves were engineering marvels that would impress modern hydraulic engineers. The weirs used precisely angled stakes that created just the right water flow, 19 fast enough to let the current through so the river wouldn't back up and flood, but positioned perfectly to trap fish swimming upstream. And here's the brilliant part. They included escape gates that ensured breeding salmon could pass through to spawn, maintaining the runs for future generations. This was sustainable resource management at a level that puts most modern fishing operations to shame. The Lummi people pioneered something called reef netting, a technique so sophisticated it seems almost magical. Two canoes would work in perfect coordination, suspending a massive net between them underwater, where it remained completely invisible to the salmon swimming above. When hundreds of fish swam over the hidden net, the fishermen would suddenly lift it, trapping an entire school in one coordinated move. The timing, the teamwork, the understanding of fish behavior required to make this work. It's like watching a perfectly choreographed dance performed on the water. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away on the Atlantic coast, the Mi'kmaq were developing their own innovations. They built stone weirs in tidal zones, permanent fishing infrastructure that used the ocean's own rhythm to trap fish. When the tide came in, fish would swim over the stone walls into enclosed areas. When the tide went out, they'd be trapped in tidal pools, ready for harvest. These stone fish traps required minimal maintenance and could operate for decades without human intervention. Each of these innovations represented something remarkable, generations upon generations of accumulated knowledge about river hydraulics, fish behavior, and seasonal patterns. But here's what makes it even more impressive. All of this knowledge was encoded in songs and stories. There were no written manuals, no engineering textbooks. The precise angles for weir stakes, the optimal timing for net deployment, the secret locations of the most productive fishing sites, ATS. All of this was preserved in oral traditions that could be passed down through families for thousands of years. Think about the level of precision required. These weren't just random fishing spots chosen by luck. Indigenous fishermen had mapped every underwater rock formation, every current pattern, every seasonal variation across river systems, spanning half a continent. They knew exactly when and where different species of salmon would appear, down to the day and sometimes down to the hour. But something even more extraordinary was about to emerge from these fishing innovations. Because when you can reliably produce massive food surpluses, when you can catch 6 months' worth of food in 3 days, you're not just surviving anymore. You're building the foundation for something much bigger. From 5,000 years before Christ to 1,000 years after Christ, RMO, we're talking about a 6,000-year span here, longer than all of recorded European history. PTAT fishing transformed from a survival strategy into something far more remarkable. It became the foundation of North America's most sophisticated indigenous civilizations. And when I say sophisticated, I mean societies that would make ancient Rome look like a backwater village. The Columbia River became the continent's greatest trade highway. Picture the Mississippi River during the height of the steamboat era. But instead of paddle wheelers carrying cotton and grain, you've got massive cedar canoes loaded with what had become more valuable than gold: properly processed salmon. A single canoe load of expertly smoked salmon could purchase dentalium shells from Vancouver Island, PHE, the equivalent of pearls in their world, obsidian blades from Mount Shasta that were sharper than modern surgical, steel, or buffalo robes from the Great Plains that represented months of hunting and processing work. Think about what this means economically. We're looking at a trade network that spanned from Alaska to Mexico, from the Pacific Ocean to the Rocky Mountains. Goods, ideas, and innovations moved along these water highways with an efficiency that European merchants wouldn't achieve for centuries. The Columbia River alone handled more trade volume than most European ports of the same era. But let's travel 3,000 miles east to the Great Lakes, where Ojibwe fishermen were developing techniques that were equally ingenious but adapted to a completely different environment. Picture this. It's the dead of winter. The lakes are frozen solid under 3 feet of ice thick enough to drive a truck across. Most people would assume fishing season is over. Not the Ojibwe. They're out there chopping holes through ice so thick it takes hours of work just to reach water. But here's where it gets fascinating. They're not just dropping lines and hoping for the best. They're using decoy fish carved from wood and bone, manipulating them with strings like underwater puppeteers to lure massive lake trout and sturgeon up from the depths. This isn't random fishing. This is psychological warfare against fish, using carved decoys that mimic injured baitfish so perfectly that predators can't resist attacking. Their neighbors, the Menominee, whose name literally means wild rice people, were equally known as the sturgeon people, and for good reason. They developed specialized spears and techniques for catching fish that could live over 2 years and weigh 300 pounds. 300 pounds. That's like landing a motorcycle that fights back. These ancient sturgeon were swimming libraries of the Great Lakes, some of them older than entire human generations, and the Menominee had figured out how to catch them consistently. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. The social structures these fishing economies created were remarkably complex, more sophisticated than most European kingdoms of the same period. Among the Tlingit, Haida, and Kwakwaka'wakw peoples of the Pacific Northwest, fishing rights became hereditary property passed through maternal lines. Specific families controlled specific streams, specific pools, specific ocean territories. This wasn't just informal tradition. This was a legal system with property rights that could be inherited, traded, or given as gifts. The potlatch ceremony functioned as both spiritual practice and the most sophisticated economic system on the continent. Picture a combination of Wall Street, Las Vegas, and the Vatican all rolled into one massive gathering. Chiefs would demonstrate their wealth and power by giving away thousands of dried salmon, gallons of eulachon oil, and other marine resources. These weren't just parties. They were complex financial instruments that redistributed wealth, cemented political alliances, and established credit relationships that could span decades. A chief might give away 10,000 dried salmon at one potlatch, knowing that this investment would generate returns for years to come. Recipients were obligated to repay with interest at future gatherings, creating a banking system that moved resources across vast distances and time periods. Some potlatch debts were passed down through generations, creating financial obligations that lasted longer than most European monarchies. Now here's something that gets overlooked in most histories. Women held absolutely crucial roles in these fishing economies. While men typically caught the fish, women controlled processing, WW, and processing was literally the difference between survival and starvation. They decided which fish to smoke, which to dry, which to render for oil, and which to ferment in specialized underground storage pits that could preserve salmon for years. Master processors knew exactly how much salt from evaporated seawater to use. Too little, and the fish would rot. Too much, and it would be inedible. They knew how to adjust smoke levels based on weather conditions, humidity, and wind patterns. They could detect the subtle signs that indicated perfect preservation, APR, changes in color, texture, and smell, that meant the difference between 6 months of food security and catastrophic spoilage. This knowledge, passed from grandmother to granddaughter through hands-on training that took decades to master, was so valuable that processing specialists could demand payment equivalent to skilled artisans in any civilization. We're talking about women who commanded the same respect and compensation as master weaponsmiths or master builders. At Celilo Falls, the crown jewel of North American fishing sites, 15,000 people would gather during peak salmon runs. 15,000. That's larger than most European cities of the medieval period. They spoke dozens of different languages but were united by shared fishing protocols that had been refined over millennia. The carved wooden platforms extending over the falls represented engineering achievements that required master builders who understood both architecture and hydrology. These platforms had to withstand the crushing force of millions of gallons of water rushing through narrow channels while supporting fishermen using dip nets on 30-foot poles. Think about the physics involved. The strength, balance, and precise timing required to successfully net salmon in turbulent waters that could instantly sweep away anyone who made a mistake. This was extreme fishing that made modern extreme sports look like children's games. The fishermen themselves were elite athletes. Using a 30-foot dip net in churning rapids requires the coordination of a gymnast, the strength of a weightlifter, and the timing of a surgeon. One slip, one moment of lost concentration, and you're swept into waters that could kill you in seconds. Yet these men made it look effortless, filling nets with silver salmon while balancing on wooden platforms suspended over nature's most violent hydraulics. But what made all of this possible wasn't just individual skill, 2PMO. It was the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of generations. Every fishing technique, every platform design, every processing method represented thousands of years of trial and error, success and failure, innovation and refinement. This was technology in its purest form, 200 setes, human intelligence applied to natural resources to create abundance from scarcity. The seasonal cycles became the heartbeat of entire civilizations. Communities planned their entire yearly calendar around salmon runs. The first salmon ceremony marked the beginning of the fishing season with rituals that ensured the salmon's spiritual cooperation. The technology of fishing was inseparable from the spirituality of fishing. You couldn't have one without the other. What we're looking at here is something unprecedented in human history. Hunter-gatherer societies that achieved the population densities and social complexity, usually associated with agricultural civilizations, but without agriculture. These were cities built on fish, empires founded on the silver highways of salmon runs. But empires built on natural abundance face a particular vulnerability. When that abundance comes under threat, when those silver highways begin to run dry, everything built upon them hangs in the balance. In 1542, Spanish explorer Juan Rodríguez Cabrillo sailed past the mouth of the Columbia River and missed it, entirely in the fog. Just sailed right past. Had he managed to find that river mouth and entered, he would have witnessed something that would have blown his mind, the greatest salmon fishery on planet Earth, where native fishermen were landing over 40 million pounds of salmon annually, using methods his own engineers couldn't replicate with all their European technology. 40 million pounds. Let that sink in for a moment. That's the equivalent of 200 fully loaded Boeing 747 jets worth of fish, caught every single year using what Europeans would dismiss as primitive tools. When Europeans finally did recognize these resources 2 centuries later, their first instinct was exactly what you'd expect. They dismissed native techniques as backwards and primitive, attempting to apply industrial methods that failed so spectacularly it would be funny if it weren't so tragic. The Hudson's Bay Company learned this lesson the hard way, through costly failure that nearly bankrupted their fishing operations. In 1825, they established their first commercial fishing operations using European-style nets and techniques that had worked perfectly well in Scottish rivers and North Sea waters. The result? They caught almost nothing while native fishermen working the same waters alongside them filled canoe after canoe with salmon. Picture the scene. European fishing crews with their advanced equipment struggling to catch enough fish to feed themselves, while indigenous fishermen using traditional methods are hauling in massive catches just yards away. The Europeans' nets were wrong for the currents, their timing was off, their positioning was all incorrect. Everything they thought they knew about fishing simply didn't work in these waters. Desperate company managers tried to hire native fishermen, but they ran into something Europeans couldn't understand. Spiritual protocols that required ceremonies and timing the Europeans considered. Superstitious waste. To indigenous fishermen, fishing wasn't just a job, parlor may. It was a sacred relationship with the salmon people that required proper rituals, correct timing, and spiritual preparation. You couldn't just show up with a paycheck and expect someone to abandon thousands of years of spiritual practice. Only when they were facing bankruptcy did Hudson's Bay Company managers swallow their pride and begin copying native methods. Even then, they never matched indigenous efficiency. It was like trying to replicate a master craftsman's work by watching from a distance. You could copy the motions, but you couldn't duplicate the generations of accumulated knowledge that made those motions effective. But the real catastrophe began in 1849 with California's gold rush. Suddenly, 40,000 fortune seekers descended on California like a plague of locusts, and they brought with them an environmental destruction that defies imagination. 49ers diverted entire rivers for mining operations, dumped millions of tons of sediment into spawning grounds, and used dynamite to blast traditional fishing sites out of existence for quick access to gold deposits. The Sacramento River, once home to salmon, runs so dense that horses would refuse to cross the water. Imagine that. Salmon runs so thick that horses thought it was solid ground. Tomapo Band became a muddy trickle poisoned with mining chemicals. Native fishermen who protested this destruction were simply shot. No trials, no negotiations, no compensation. Just gunned down for trying to protect resources that had sustained their people for thousands of years. The Wintu people lost 90% of their population in just 3 years. 90%. That's not just death from disease or violence, too. That's the complete collapse of a civilization. And with them died irreplaceable knowledge about managing California's complex river systems, knowledge that took millennia to develop and can never be recovered. Legal warfare proved as devastating as physical violence, maybe more so because it gave the appearance of legitimacy to what was essentially theft. The Treaty of Point Elliott in 1855 appeared to guarantee fishing rights in common with other citizens, but courts interpreted this phrase in the most restrictive way possible, as subordinate to commercial operations rather than as equal rights. When native fishermen tried to exercise these supposedly guaranteed treaty rights, they faced arrest, beatings, and confiscation of their equipment. Billy Frank Sr., father of the famous activist, was first arrested for fishing at age 14 in 1845. 14 years old, arrested for doing what his ancestors had done for 10,000 years on their own ancestral waters. This began a family tradition of resistance that would span generations and eventually change American law. But the dam builders delivered the killing blow. Grand Coulee Dam, completed in 1941, had no fish ladders. None. The engineers simply wrote off salmon access to thousands of miles of spawning habitat as acceptable collateral damage for hydroelectric power. It was like building a wall across a highway and then acting surprised when traffic couldn't get through. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the drowning of Celilo Falls in 1957 behind the Dalles Dam. This wasn't just the destruction of a fishing site, this was the obliteration of the sacred heart of Pacific Northwest indigenous culture. Celilo Falls had been continuously occupied for over 10,000 years. 10,000 years. That's longer than all of written human history. Native fishermen wept openly as they watched the rising waters of the reservoir slowly swallow the roaring falls that had echoed through the Columbia River Gorge since the end of the last ice age. An elder named George Aguilar stood watching the rising waters and said something that captures the size, magnitude of this loss. I feel like my heart is stopping too. Think about what was lost. This wasn't just a fishing spot. This was a university, a cathedral, a Wall Street trading floor, and a family reunion site all rolled into one. 15,000 years of accumulated knowledge about fishing techniques, river hydraulics, and salmon behavior. Spiritual practices that connected people to the natural world. Economic relationships that sustained trade networks across half a continent. Social gatherings that had maintained diplomatic relationships between dozens of tribes for millennia. All of it vanished beneath the waters of a reservoir designed to generate electricity for aluminum smelters. The Army Corps of Engineers calculated that Celilo Falls was worth exactly $8 million in compensation to affected tribes. $8 million for 10,000 years of continuous civilization. That works out to about $800 per century of cultural heritage. The speed of this destruction is almost incomprehensible. In less than a century, Fishing systems that had sustained millions of people for 10,000 years were nearly eliminated. Rivers that had run silver with salmon for millennia were reduced to concrete channels and stagnant reservoirs. Indigenous peoples who had managed these resources sustainably for hundreds of generations were criminalized for trying to continue their traditional practices. But here's the thing about people who have survived for 10,000 years. They don't disappear easily. Even as their physical infrastructure was being destroyed, even as their legal rights were being trampled, even as their elders were dying and taking irreplaceable knowledge with them, the fishing people were preparing for a different kind of war. A legal war that would challenge the very foundations of American law and ultimately restore rights that many assumed were lost forever. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would pit traditional fishing rights against commercial interests, federal law against state authority, and indigenous persistence against the assumption that progress meant the elimination of traditional ways of life. In 1964, a Nisqually fisherman named Billy Frank Jr. paddled his canoe onto the Nisqually River carrying a traditional dip net, knowing full well that police officers were waiting on the shore with handcuffs. This was his 51st arrest for the crime of exercising treaty fishing rights. His 51st arrest for doing what his ancestors had done legally for thousands of years. But this arrest was different. This time, Billy Frank Jr. wasn't just fishing. He was starting a war. The Fish Wars. And like all the best wars, this one would be fought not with bullets and bombs, but with lawyers and television cameras, civil disobedience and celebrity protesters, federal judges and Supreme Court justices. The images were powerful, and they were meant to be. Native fishermen facing police clubs and tear gas for trying to catch salmon in their ancestral waters. Coast Guard vessels ramming traditional canoes. Fishermen being dragged away in handcuffs while their nets filled with salmon floated away downstream. This was Bull Connor and Birmingham all over again, but played out on the rivers of Washington state. Celebrities started showing up. Marlon Brando got himself arrested alongside native fishermen, bringing national television coverage to what had been dismissed as a local issue. Dick Gregory, the comedian and civil rights activist, was pulled from the Nisqually River in handcuffs. Jane Fonda paddled out in solidarity. Suddenly, the fish wars weren't just a regional conflict. They were a national civil rights issue, with network news coverage and magazine features. But the real genius of the fish wars wasn't the protests, it was the legal strategy. Native activists and their lawyers were systematically documenting every treaty, every piece of evidence showing continuous fishing traditions, every historical precedent they could find. They were building a case that would challenge not just Washington state fishing regulations, but the fundamental relationship between tribal sovereignty and federal authority. The breakthrough came in 1974 with a federal court decision that changed everything. Judge George Bolt, yes, and remember this name, because Bolt became either a hero or a villain depending on where you stood, ruled that treaties signed in the 1850s guaranteed native tribes 50% of harvestable salmon. Not 50% of what was left after commercial fishermen took their share. Not 50% of some token amount. 50% of all harvestable salmon in Washington state waters. The reaction was explosive. Commercial fishermen rioted. They burned Judge Bolt in effigy. They organized massive protests demanding that the federal government overturn the decision. Bumper stickers appeared reading, "Can Judge Bolt and let Bolt fish?" The governor of Washington state called the decision a threat to the state's economy. Congressional representatives demanded federal intervention to protect commercial fishing interests. But here's the thing about federal law, aka, it trumps state law, and treaty rights trump everything else. The Supreme Court upheld Bolt's decision, establishing once and for all that when the United States government signed treaties guaranteeing fishing rights, those weren't suggestions or symbolic gestures. They were binding legal commitments that created permanent property rights. For the first time in over a century, native fishermen could fish legally in their ancestral waters without fear of arrest. But legal victory was just the beginning. The salmon runs themselves were in collapse. What good are fishing rights if there are no fish to catch? This is where the story takes a remarkable turn toward restoration and renewal. Modern dam removal projects began to blend traditional indigenous knowledge with cutting-edge environmental science in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. The removal of the Elwha Dam in 2014 represents the largest dam removal project in human history. But what made it truly extraordinary wasn't just the engineering feat, it was the ceremony and preparation that preceded it. Elders from the Lower Elwha Klalam tribe performed rituals to call salmon home to waters they hadn't seen in over a century. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were spiritual technologies for reconnecting with natural systems that had been severed by concrete and steel. The results exceeded every scientific prediction. Within 3 years, Chinook salmon were spotted above the former dam site, swimming in waters their species hadn't accessed for 100 years. Scientists expressed amazement at the speed of recovery, but tribal fishermen simply said the salmon had been waiting, remembering in their genes the path home. This is where traditional knowledge and modern science began to converge in powerful ways. Young native scientists like Samantha Chisholm started combining Western marine biology with ancestral wisdom, using traditional fishing calendars to predict climate change impacts with greater accuracy than government computer models. The Swinomish tribe conducted a 13-year study proving that their traditional timing indicators, subtle changes in plant growth, insect emergence patterns, bird migration timing, predicted salmon runs more accurately than state-of-the-art environmental monitoring systems. Traditional knowledge that had been dismissed as superstition turned out to be more sophisticated than satellite data and computer modeling. Today's fishing rights battles take new forms shaped by climate change and environmental restoration. Ocean temperatures are shifting, disrupting timing patterns encoded in traditional knowledge systems developed over thousands of years. Young native fishermen are adapting traditional techniques to new realities while maintaining spiritual and cultural connections to ancestral practices. The next generation inherits both crisis and opportunity in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. 16-year-old indigenous activists like Autumn Peltier address the United Nations about water protection, while tribal youth learn traditional fishing techniques through virtual reality and smartphone apps. Traditional knowledge and modern technology are converging in combinations that create new possibilities for both cultural preservation and environmental restoration. Commercial partnerships increasingly recognize native expertise in fisheries management. Tribes are managing salmon runs that consistently outperform state-run operations, demonstrating that traditional management practices aren't just culturally significant, they're more effective than industrial methods at maintaining sustainable fish populations. At dawn on the Columbia River today, young fishermen still dip nets from wooden platforms built at ancient fishing sites, their techniques refined by thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. But now they're selling their catches through smartphone apps while singing songs their ancestors sang 10,000 years ago. They're posting traditional fishing videos on social media while maintaining spiritual protocols that connect them to salmon people in ways that transcend purely economic relationships. The salmon are fewer now than they were in Ketchikan's time 10,000 years ago. The rivers run through cities and farmland instead of endless forests. The challenges are different and in many ways more complex than anything previous generations faced. Climate change, ocean acidification, habitat destruction, and pollution create problems that require both traditional wisdom and innovative solutions. But the salmon still come. Every year, they return from the ocean to the rivers where they were born, following magnetic signatures and chemical traces that guide them home across thousands of miles of open water. And the people still wait for them, maintaining relationships that stretch back to the end of the last ice age. The fishing people have learned something that serves them well in an uncertain world. Adaptation doesn't require abandonment of tradition. Innovation doesn't demand the elimination of ancient wisdom. The same creative intelligence that produced Ketchikan's revolutionary weir design continues to generate new solutions to new challenges. As long as the rivers run, as long as salmon remember the way home, as long as people maintain the knowledge and commitment to sustainable relationships with the natural world, the fishing people will endure. They've survived ice ages and European colonization, dam construction and fish wars, legal battles and climate change. They'll survive whatever comes. Next, carrying forward 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom about living in harmony with the silver highways that connect mountains to sea. The ancient contracts between people and salmon, written in ceremony and maintained through generations of careful stewardship, remain in effect. The rivers still run silver when the salmon come home,